In 1415, Henry V led the English into battle against the French.
We few, we happy few, we band of brothers.
Shakespeare made Agincourt a legendary victory, England's finest hour.
And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here.
The happy English few beat an army 3 times its size, a victory against all odds.
Hardly any English were killed for the kind of engagement it was, whereas for the French it was a carnage.
Historians have always put this triumph down to the most feared weapon in Europe, England's trump card, the longbow. In the 14th and 15th centuries, there was intense rivalry between England and France. Throughout the 100 Years' War, they battled constantly for control of land. At first, the English gained the advantage with decisive victories at Crécy and Poitiers. But by 1415, they were looking back on a generation of defeats. Henry V was the 28-year-old king of England. Although young, he was an experienced warrior. He decided to win back some English pride. Henry started well, taking the northern French port of Harfleur. And as winter approached, he began a victory march back to England. But on his way to Calais, he came face to face with French troops. This was Agincourt. In Henry's way were mostly well-armored knights. The English army was much less well protected, and they were vastly outnumbered. The Battle of Agincourt lasted around 2 hours, and the English won a stunning victory. At day's end, many thousands of French knights lay dead, victims of the English longbow. In 600 years, this landscape has changed relatively little. Then, as now, there were 3 villages, Maisoncelles, Tramcourt, and Agincourt. Between them was the main road. It was along this road that Henry was leading his troops, north to Calais. He found his way blocked by the French army, assembled to the north of Agincourt. Henry set up camp at Maisoncelles. This is the area where the battle took place. These original documents record the names of every man who left England to fight with Henry V, and every man who came back. Anne has calculated that at Agincourt there were around 7,000 on the English side. And these 7,000 English would have faced approximately 20,000 French. That the 2 armies were organized in different ways. Henry's men were paid troops and socially mixed. The French were mostly noblemen.
So there's 2 very different armies on the battlefield at Agincourt. The English army, commanded by Henry V in person, with dismounted men-at-arms. These are the heavily equipped knights. And on the flanks, archers, positioned so they could shoot at the advancing French. On the other side, Charles VI. Well, where's he? Well, he's not actually at the battlefield because he's insane, so we have to discount him. Their formation, well, they've got some missile men as well in front of the forces, flanked by cavalry whose job was to attack the English archers and drive them away.
From the moment the English set foot on the field, the odds were stacked against them. Confronted by heavily armed French nobles in much greater numbers, how could Henry possibly hope to win this encounter? On the morning of the 25th of October, 1415, Henry V's 7,000 men prepared to face 20,000 French on the battlefield of Agincourt. Legend has it they would stand up to a formidable cavalry charge and mow it down with a hail of arrows. In their hands, a super weapon, the longbow. Powerful and deadly even at long range, it has been called the machine gun of the Middle Ages. So what was it about the longbow that gave these men the power to overcome vastly superior numbers?
It's a very simple weapon to use. The energy stored in that bow is tremendous. They were shooting off anywhere between 8 to 12 arrows in a minute. As long as they can do that, they can put this blanket firepower down.
What gave the longbow its crucial advantage was the speed with which it could be shot. It was 4 times as fast to reload as other weapons of the time, such as the French crossbow. So in the opening moments of the Battle of Agincourt, 55,000 English arrows would have rained down on the French knights.
The presence of a foreign king and an invading army seems to have really rallied France in a way that I don't think Henry expected, and I don't think the French did either.
But it wasn't only the French nobles who were stirred up by the call to arms. In Paris, more than 6,000 common townsfolk signed up to fight the English.
The French nobility do not want to run the risk of arming the peasantry. It's just seen as too dangerous. Second, and much bigger reason, is the whole chivalric outlook. Because France is the home of chivalry, it should be the aristocracy that form the army and win the battles. And they don't want the ordinary rabble, the hoi polloi, getting any of that glory.
In October 1415, the English army marched north from Harfleur. They were heading for the safe haven of Calais, an English-held port. King Henry V had received reports that a huge French army was gathering to fight him, but he wasn't prepared to abandon his mission without a final show of strength.
Henry V's strategy in 1415 was to drive through the French countryside, torching and destroying and pillaging in order to demoralize the French population and to undermine the position of the French king.
The combined forces of the French nobility were now closing in on Henry's men.
For the English troops moving through the Norman countryside, it must have been a terrifying experience.
French scouts looked on as more than 2,000 Englishmen, 1/4 of Henry's army, died of dysentery. But the soldier in charge of the French army was in no hurry to do battle. Experience told him to bide his time. Small English armies had inflicted heavy defeats on French forces before in the 100 Years' War, at Crécy and Poitiers. In those battles, French cavalry charges had been decimated by units of English archers, fighting in groups alongside armored knights and men-at-arms.
Just as we reached the top of the hill, on the other side, we saw emerging about half a mile away from us the grim-looking ranks of the French, filling the broad field like a countless swarm of locusts. And the forest of spears, with the great helmets gleaming in between, was truly terrifying. And there was only a valley, and not so wide at that, between us and them.
At dawn, on the 25th of October, the combined armies of the French nobility prepared to bury their differences and crush their weakened English enemy. For 3 hours, the armies stood and watched each other. Then, at 11 a.m., Henry ordered his men to advance. The English archers had taken up position at the narrowest point on the battlefield. Protected on each flank by dense woodland, there was no room for Boucicault's horsemen to make their flanking attack. But for the French nobles, the crude taunts of the English had become too much to bear. Without waiting for orders, the leader of the cavalry, William de Saveuse, launched a head-on charge against the English line. By ignoring their commander, Marshal Boucicault, the French nobility had played straight into the English hands. A head-on cavalry charge into the lines of battle-hardened English troops was doomed.
For Boucicault, the point must have come when he realised that it was all going horribly wrong. I think they clearly underestimated the effect that the English archers were going to have.
Within minutes, hundreds of horses and their riders were cut to ribbons by a storm of arrows. The French commander, Marshal Boucicault's carefully laid plans were being shot down by a ruthless English war machine. Gilbert de Lannoy and his fellow knights looked on in horror as the French cavalry was cut to pieces. Now, with their honor on the line, there could be no going back. Davy Gam, John Leverage, and the rest of Henry's men were outnumbered by more than 3 to 1. Thousands of dismounted French knights now charged at their line. The French thundered into the center of the English line. For a moment, the line began to give way. But the English discipline of Leverage, Gam, and Henry's men paid off. The English held firm. And now it was the French knights, like Lannoy, who had a problem. It had been raining hard for 2 weeks. If Lannoy fell in the boggy ground, it would be impossible to get up in his heavy armor. Panic was beginning to spread through the French ranks. And now a new, unforeseen danger was gathering.
There were simply too many French knights for that particular battlefield. Although they were hugely skilled and incredibly well equipped, none of that matters if you can't move and you can't breathe and if you can barely stand up.
The horses have been maddened by all these arrows, and the horses are actually leaping over them and crushing them, and yet they've got all this pressure of the weight of the men behind them as well.
As the French bodies piled up in front of the English lines, the English archers abandoned their bows and swept into the fray with dagger and malice. For Lannoy and his noble knights, the unthinkable was happening. Trapped in the mud and crushed by the men coming on behind, the French knights had become sitting ducks. Less than 1 hour after the French cavalry charge, 1,200 humiliated knights found themselves prisoners of the English. Amongst them, the French commander-in-chief, Marshal Jean Boucicault.
If it is a consolation for men of honor to think they have been beaten by adversaries of noble origin, it is a double shame to be defeated by unworthy and vile Englishmen.
What had promised to be a glorious victory for the French was turning into a massacre. It's thought that at least 8,000 French knights were slaughtered in the first 90 minutes of battle. Two hours after the first disastrous cavalry charge,
The French are within feet of actually killing Henry V himself, and that's how close the French got. One of the jewels on his own circlet crown, the helmet that the king was wearing, is hacked off. And if the king had been cut down, it would have been game over. It would have been the end of the battle.
The Duke of Brabant's attack had come close to turning the tide of battle. But it was not to be. By mid-afternoon, a famous English victory was almost secure. But King Henry now had a problem. He'd taken thousands of prisoners, far more than his men could handle. Fearing they would rise up and join Brabant's last-ditch attack, Henry now called up his toughest unit of archers, amongst them John Leveridge. His orders? To kill the French prisoners in cold blood. More than 2,000 prisoners were burned alive or butchered by Leveridge and his fellow longbowmen. It was a shocking violation of the chivalric code.
This one thing is seen as being the big blot on Henry V's character is that he ordered the massacre of all the French prisoners during the Battle of Agincourt. It just goes against all our notions of what chivalry is meant to be.
We have to understand that when Henry V had taken those prisoners, it was an entirely sensible military decision to kill them.
The age of chivalry was over. The battle that had set the seal on the medieval age decimated the French nobility, which lost its hold on power. But in a final twist, this defeat would sow the seeds of victory. A new and modern army rose from the ashes of Agincourt, led not by noble knights, but unified under a lowly peasant girl, Joan of Arc.